Good Friday morning, Mount Olive family and friends of Mount Olive, all of you who have taken the time to tune in and log on and watch these devotions. Appreciate, as I always say, appreciate each one of you for taking the time to do that. We get my screen up now. I'll move myself out of the way a little bit. So Pastor TJ started a new series which he titled Facing the Giants. This week's subtopic was victory, and he used 1 Samuel 17 is his reference. Now, this chapter is about the Philistine army that coming up to fight against Israel, and the Bible tells us that each army was on a mountain across from each other, and there was a valley between them. I found this graphic. This is the story about Goliath and David. So Goliath, on this one, he says he measured about 9'6". So, this is, as I said, this chapter is where we're introduced to the Philistine giant Goliath. He was the champion of the Philistine army. And depending on what measurement value you use, Goliath was over 9 feet tall. As I said, the graphic here, he has him at 9'6". The graphic also shows that the average height of an Israeli soldier would have been about 5'8". Now, David was only a lad, so his height was probably much smaller. So some have Goliath at 9 foot, some others have him at 10 foot. Either way, he was a very tall man, and he was one to be reckoned with. The Bible tells that every day for 40 days, Goliath would go down in the valley and call out to the army of Israel to send down a challenger and let them fight. And whoever loses, that nation would serve the other nation. But Israel had no one who would go down, not even King Saul, who God had chosen and given to the nation of Israel. Now, our giant, it may not be 9 feet tall, but we still have a formidable giant that we will confront. And here's a point that Pastor TJ made. He said the enemy of the people of God have an enemy and face the giants put before us. Now, why wouldn't King Saul go down and defend his nation? Since God had chosen him, God had picked him out. Israel wanted a king, and he sent Samuel, and Samuel was looking at other ones, and but God, he saw Saul, said that he was head and shoulders above everyone else, so he was a little taller. So God chose him. But the problem was that God had chosen him, but was no longer with Saul because of Saul's disobedience. Now let's take a look at chapter 15, verses 1 through 3. Self out of the way here again. I'm all over the place here. It says, Samuel said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint thee, to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken thou unto the voice of the words of the Lord. So Samuel goes to Saul. He says, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people. Now, you hearken to the words of that the Lord has spoken. Verse 2, it says, thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Verse 3 says, now go down and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. We think, well, man, that's pretty awful, that God would be like that. But Amalek and his people, when Israel was coming out of Egypt, they came out and fought against Israel. Now, Israel they weren't a warrior nation yet, but, Amalek definitely had the advantage, but with God, Joshua, with God's help, was able to defeat the Amalekites. But God said that he would wipe them out completely. Now, in Exodus 17 and 14, it says, and the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. Now we go back to that verse. Verse 3 says, Now go down and spite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Now hundreds of years had passed, but now God, through Samuel the prophet, tells Saul that God has not forgotten his promise. God will not forget his promise. And Saul is to be the instrument to accomplish this. So when God makes a promise, even though these hundreds of years have passed, he doesn't forget. We'll make a promise we sometimes forget. God doesn't. And he's faithful to carry out that promise. But, there's always a but, isn't there, when it comes to man. But look at what verse 9 of 15 says. But Saul and the people spared Agag. He was the king of the Amalekites, and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fatlings and of the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuge, that they destroyed utterly. In 10 it says, Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried unto the Lord all night. Now Samuel, he goes down and he meets Saul, the story goes, and he asks Saul, he says, What is this bleating of the sheep and the lowing of the ox that I hear in my ears? And Saul's response was in verse 21, in verse I don't have that verse. Sorry. But he tries to put it off on the people. In verse 1, he says, But the people took of the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the chief of the things which shouldn't have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. He says, and then Samuel says, so, like most times, when people sin, we try to put it off on someone else. Samuel, he said, I obeyed God, but I've just brought Agag back. He's the only one. But now the people, they brought all the rest of this stuff back, and because they were going to sacrifice it to the Lord. But Samuel says, he says, hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, it is better than sacrifice. Sorry, let me start all over that. I'm reading too fast. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. So Samuel said, if you had just done what God said, that obedience is better than sacrifice. So we need to remember that. Now Saul here, and he tells him in verse 23, I go to verse 23, he says, for rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. And then I underline this part. It says, because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king. And that's why, it's so sometimes I wonder, why did Saul do this? He knew what he said, but Saul wanted to do things his way. He didn't want to do things God's way. He did, God didn't ask for a sacrifice, he asked for service. And he should have done that, but no, he didn't. He had to do things his way. And so, when Saul didn't go down and answer the challenge, that's why, he didn't go down to answer the challenge of Goliath. He no longer had God on his side. If he would have, he would have been going down on his own. And he knew, because that he had done this back in chapter 15, God wasn't with him. He'd be going down on his own. He would probably, it'd be a short battle. Now, Pastor TJ had one of these quotes. He says, if you're not faithful in the small things, don't expect God to move in the big things. So if Saul wasn't faithful in carrying out what he told him to against the Amalekites, was God going to, could he expect God to move on the big things, and namely this giant Goliath? No, he couldn't do that. So, that's basically where my devotion is going to end with here. I want you to come back this Sunday. And for all of you that are my age, plus or minus, as radio announcer Paul Harvey used to say, and now for the rest of the story. So come back and see what's going to happen in this Sunday after Saul he can't go down. He's the Lord has left him, but God always provides, doesn't he? So come back this Sunday, and let's be much in prayer for all those who will be coming Sunday. God knows who they are. We may not know right now. We don't know right now who's coming, who can't, but God does. And let's just pray that God's already working on their hearts, that they'll see their need for a Savior. Love each one of you, and we'll see you Sunday.